7. Dealerships quoted the female CEO, $70,000. She expected huge bill, but single dad, charged only $60. The phone was already ringing before Caroline Webb had finished her first cup of coffee. She let it ring. She had learned, over 14 years of running a company, that the world moved faster when she moved at her own pace, and not at the pace the world demanded of her. She set the cup down, smoothed the front of her jacket, and then picked up. It was her office manager, the company vehicle she used for client meetings. A dark gray SUV with close to 90,000 miles on it had thrown a warning light the night before. The engine was making a sound, not a loud sound, not a dramatic one, just a low, irregular knock that had not been there the week before. Caroline knew what that meant. It meant a trip to a mechanic. It meant time she did not have, money she would rather spend elsewhere, and a conversation she had never once in her life enjoyed. She was the chief executive officer of a logistics consulting firm that operated across 4 states. She had built it from a 2-person operation running out of a spare bedroom to a company with 31 full-time employees and contracts with 6 mid-size manufacturers. She had done that without a business partner, without inherited capital, and without the kind of professional network that opens doors before you even knock. Every door she had walked through, she had pushed open herself. She knew how to negotiate. She knew how to read people. She knew, better than most, when someone was trying to take advantage of her. She made the first call at 7:45 in the morning. The dealership that serviced her vehicle's brand was 20 minutes from her office. She had taken the SUV there once before, 2 years ago, for a routine service. The experience had been unremarkable, which in her mind counted as a positive. She described the knocking sound to the service advisor over the phone, mentioned the warning light, and asked for an appointment. They told her to bring it in that afternoon. She did. The service advisor who met her at the intake bay was polite, in the way that people are polite when they are about to deliver news they expect you to accept without question. He walked around the vehicle with a clipboard, nodded several times at nothing in particular, and told her they would need to run a full diagnostic before they could give her a number. She agreed. She sat in the waiting area for an hour and 40 minutes, answered 11 emails, and reviewed a contract amendment her legal team had flagged. Then the service advisor came back. He sat down across from her. He had a printout in his hand. He placed it on the table between them, with the kind of deliberate care that people use when they want the paper to feel official. The estimate was $9,400. Caroline looked at the number. She looked at it for a long moment without saying anything, which was a technique she had developed over years of sitting across tables from people who expected her to react before she had thought clearly. Then she asked what, specifically, the $9,400 would cover. The service advisor explained. The explanation involved several technical terms delivered in rapid succession, a reference to parts that needed to be ordered, and a mention of labor costs that were, he said, standard for this kind of repair. She asked which parts. He named them. She asked how long the repair would take. He said 4 to 5 business days. She thanked him, took the printout, and said she would be in touch. She drove home with the knocking sound still there, unchanged, no worse than it had been that morning. That evening, she sat at her kitchen table with her laptop and looked up the specific fault code that the dealership had pulled from her vehicle's computer. She found forums. She found discussions between people who clearly knew what they were talking about. The fault code pointed to something relatively contained, a sensor issue, possibly a minor mechanical problem in one specific component, not the comprehensive system failure the dealership's estimate had implied. She was not a mechanic. She knew that. But she also knew how to read, and what she was reading did not match what the service advisor had described. She called a second dealership the next morning. This one was on the other side of the city. She described the fault code, described the sound, and asked for a quote over the phone. The man she spoke to said he could not give her a number without seeing the vehicle. She brought it in 2 days later, on a Thursday morning, before her first meeting. She waited again. This time the estimate was $11,200. The breakdown was different from the first one. Different parts, different labor hours, a different diagnosis for what was, apparently, the same vehicle with the same problem. She drove to her office with the second printout in her bag, and a question forming in her mind that she could not quite ignore. She called a third dealership from her office that afternoon, and a fourth the following Monday, and a fifth after that. She kept a spreadsheet. She was the kind of person who kept spreadsheets for things that other people would have tracked in a notes app, or not tracked at all. The spreadsheet had columns for the dealership name, the name of the service advisor, the initial quote, the itemized breakdown, and a column she labeled, explanation given. She filled in each row carefully. She was not angry yet. She was collecting information. That was what she did before she allowed herself to feel anything. She collected information first. By the time she had called the sixth dealership, she had quotes ranging from $8,800 to $14,600. No two of them agreed on what was wrong. No two of them agreed on what needed to be replaced. One advisor told her the entire rear suspension assembly was compromised. Another told her the problem was isolated to the front. A third said the issue was almost certainly related to the engine mounts and had nothing to do with the sensor at all. She sat with her spreadsheet and read through it twice, the way she read through contracts, looking for the thing that did not fit, the line that did not belong. She called a seventh dealership because she believed in being thorough. The seventh was the largest in the region. It had a glass-fronted showroom, a coffee bar in the waiting area, and a service team that wore matching shirts with their names embroidered above the pocket. The service advisor who handled her vehicle was confident. He was the most confident person she had encountered across all 7 visits, which under different circumstances might have been reassuring. He pulled her vehicle in, ran the diagnostic, and came back to her with a presentation that was, she thought, the most elaborate explanation of car trouble she had ever seen. There were photographs on a tablet. There were arrows pointing to things she could not quite identify. There was a number at the bottom of the screen. $70,000. She read the number. She read it again. Then she looked up at the service advisor and asked him to repeat it. He repeated it. He explained that based on what they had found, the vehicle required not only the repair she had come in for, but a comprehensive overhaul of multiple systems that were, in his professional opinion, approaching the end of their functional lifespan. He said the words preventative and long-term value, and we want to make sure you're protected. He said all of this with the steady composure of a man who expected the conversation to end with her handing over a key and a card number. She stood up. She picked up her bag. She thanked him for his time, and she left. She sat in the parking lot for 4 minutes. Not because she was upset. She was past upset by then. She had moved through something and come out the other side of it, into a place that was quieter and colder and considerably more focused. She was past the heat of it. What she felt now was something cleaner, a hard, clear certainty that what had been done to her across 7 different service counters, by 7 different advisors in 7 different buildings, was not an accident. It was not a coincidence of bad estimates or honest professional disagreement. It was a pattern, and she had documented every piece of it. She opened her spreadsheet on her phone and added the 7th row, $70,000 in the estimate column. She looked at the column of numbers, 8,900, 11,200, 14,600, and now 70,000. For the same vehicle, the same fault code, the same knock in the engine that had started on an ordinary Tuesday night and had not, in all the weeks since she had first noticed it, gotten any worse. She drove home slowly. The knock was still there, low and steady, the same as it had always been. The vehicle was not falling apart. She knew that now with a certainty she had not had when this started. Whatever was wrong with it was real but contained, a specific problem with a specific fix, not the cascading failure 7 different advisors had tried to sell her on. She was going to find someone who would tell her the truth. She did not know yet who that person was. She did not know that finding him would take a few more days, a recommendation from an unexpected source, and a drive to a part of the city she had never had a reason to visit. She did not know that the person she was about to meet would charge her $60, and that $60 would stay in her memory, long after she had forgotten the names of every advisor who had handed her a printout with a number that bore no relationship to reality. She only knew, sitting in her car in the parking lot of the 7th dealership with her spreadsheet open on her phone, that she was not done yet. She had not even started. The week after the 7th dealership, Caroline did not make any more calls to service centers. She had learned what calls to service centers produced. She had 7 spreadsheet rows to prove it. Instead, she went back to the forums she had found on the night she first looked up the fault code, and she read more carefully this time, and she read for longer. The forums were populated by people who had owned the same model of SUV for years. They knew the vehicle the way Caroline knew her company's financial statements, not as a set of abstract figures but as something living, something with patterns and tendencies and specific weak points that revealed themselves at predictable intervals. They discussed fault codes with the casual fluency of people who had memorized them. They linked to repair manuals. They argued, sometimes at great length, about the right approach to a given problem, and in their arguments she found more honest information than she had received across 7 professional consultations. The fault code her vehicle had thrown pointed, in the consensus of 3 separate forum threads, to a crankshaft position sensor. The part itself was inexpensive. The replacement was not complex. It required a specific tool to access the sensor's location, and in some cases the surrounding bracket needed to be adjusted, which added some time to the job. But it was, by every account she read, a repair that a competent mechanic could complete in under 2 hours. She created a new column in her spreadsheet. She labeled it what it should actually be. She typed in what the forums described. Then she looked at the column next to it, the 7 quotes from the 7 dealerships, and she sat with that for a while. She had not told many people what she was going through. She was a private person by nature, and a careful one by practice. She did not share problems she had not yet solved, but she had mentioned the situation, briefly and without much detail, to a woman named Donna Hartley, who ran a small accounting firm 2 floors below Caroline's office, and with whom Caroline sometimes shared an elevator and occasional conversation. Donna was the kind of person who knew everyone, not in a social, networked, professional way, in the way that people who pay attention to other people eventually accumulate, through years of small transactions and honest interactions with a wide variety of human beings. Donna knocked on Caroline's office door on a Wednesday morning, which she had never done before. She had heard, she said, that Caroline was having trouble getting a straight answer on a car repair. She had mentioned it to her husband, who mentioned it to a man he played cards with on Friday nights, who said there was a mechanic on the east side who was different from the others. Not a dealership, a small shop. He had been going there for 11 years. His daughter had started going there after him. His brother had followed. The man who ran it, the card player said, was the kind of mechanic who told you what was wrong without telling you what else might also be wrong. Might need attention someday. Might as well be looked at while they were in there. He only fixed what was broken. He charged what it actually cost. The shop's name was written on a piece of paper that Donna placed on Caroline's desk. Below the name was a phone number, written in her husband's handwriting. Below the phone number was one line, "Ask for Nathan." Caroline looked at the paper. She picked it up. She put it in her jacket pocket and thanked Donna, who nodded once and left without making it into anything larger than it was. That afternoon, Caroline called the number. A man answered after 2 rings. His voice was unhurried. He said the name of the shop and then waited. She described the vehicle, the fault code, the knocking sound, and the length of time the problem had been present. He did not interrupt her. When she finished, he asked 2 questions. The first was about the conditions under which the knock became more noticeable: cold starts, highway speed, or idling. The second was about whether the warning light had ever cleared itself between trips. She answered both. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said he had a good idea of what it likely was, but he would want to look at it before he said anything definitive. He told her she could bring it in on Friday morning. He said the diagnostic would not cost her anything. She wrote the address on the same piece of paper where his name was written, and put it back in her pocket. On Friday morning she drove across the city to a part of it she did not often visit. The streets here were narrower. The buildings were lower. There were family-owned restaurants with hand-lettered signs in the windows, a laundromat with a folded flag in the corner of its display, a hardware store that looked as though it had been in the same location for a generation. The shop was on a corner. It was a single-story building with white paint that had gone slightly gray at the edges, and 2 bay doors, both of them open. A hand-painted sign above the entrance gave the shop's name in blue letters. There was no showroom. There was no coffee machine. There was a small waiting area just inside the door with 4 chairs, a side table stacked with magazines from the previous year, and a corkboard on the wall covered in notes and cards, and what appeared to be a child's drawing in crayon of a car, with extremely round wheels. A man came out from one of the bays, wiping his hands on a clean rag. He was probably in his late 30s. He was not particularly tall. He wore a gray work shirt with the shop's name on it, and looked at her, the way people look at you when they are actually paying attention. His name was Nathan Cole. He shook her hand. He said good morning. He did not call her ma'am, and he did not call her by her first name without being invited to. He just said good morning, and then he said, without any preamble, that he should take a look. She handed him the keys. She sat down in one of the 4 chairs. She picked up one of the old magazines and did not read it. She looked instead at the corkboard. The crayon drawing in the lower right corner showed a vehicle, recognizably a car of some kind, though with an optimistic interpretation of automotive proportion, and below it, in large uneven letters that were clearly the work of a young child, the words, "My dad's shop." There was no apostrophe. The letters were blue, the same shade as the sign outside. She looked at the waiting area around her. There was a second corkboard near the door that she had not noticed when she came in. It was covered with notes, handwritten ones, many of them, thank you notes, a few printed emails. Some were brief, others were long enough that someone had clearly sat down and written them with intention. One was dated 3 years ago. One was recent. She did not read them, because they were not addressed to her, but she saw enough to understand what they were. She put the magazine back on the stack. She sat with her hands in her lap and listened to the sounds coming from the bay where Nathan was working on her vehicle. The particular language of tools on metal, the small pauses that meant he was looking at something, the occasional sound of him moving around the vehicle to approach it from a different angle. He came back in 35 minutes. He sat down in the chair across from her, not at a desk, not with a clipboard between them, just in the chair across from hers, and he told her what he had found. The crankshaft position sensor. Exactly what the forums had described. It had failed partially, which was why the warning light had come on, and why the engine was producing that low knock at certain intervals. The sensor itself needed to be replaced. The bracket around it was fine. The surrounding components were fine. The engine mounts were fine. The suspension was fine. Everything that 7 service advisors had told her was compromised or failing, or approaching the end of its lifespan was, in Nathan's assessment, in reasonable condition for a vehicle of this age and mileage. She looked at him. She said quietly that she had been quoted $9,000 at one place and $70,000 at another. He nodded. He did not look surprised. He did not look indignant on her behalf in a performed way. He just nodded, in the way of someone who has heard this kind of thing before and understands what it means. He said the part cost $11 and some change. He said the labor would take him about an hour and a half, maybe 2 hours if the bracket gave him any trouble. He named a number. $60. She said it back to him, not as a question exactly, more as a way of making sure she had heard it correctly. He said yes, $60, and he said it with the same tone he had used for everything else, level, direct, without any flourish. He was not performing generosity. He was not offering her a favor. He was telling her what the job was worth, and the job was worth $60. She asked him when he could do it. He said he could start right now if she was not in a hurry. She said she was not in a hurry. She went back to the chair. He went back to the bay. She sat in the small waiting room with the old magazines and the crayon drawing on the corkboard, and listened to the sounds of someone working on her vehicle, with the same unhurried attention he had given to every other part of the morning. And she thought about the 7 spreadsheet rows on her phone, and the numbers in the estimate column, and what those numbers had assumed about her, and what they had gotten wrong. She did not cry. She was not a person who cried easily, and she was not about to start in a waiting room with 4 chairs and a side table. But something shifted in her, sitting there, something she did not have a clean word for. It was not relief exactly, although relief was part of it. It was not gratitude, although that was part of it too. It was something closer to the feeling of putting a heavy bag down, not a dramatic dropping, just a setting down, a recognition that the weight had been there, and that now it was not. The knock was gone when she pulled out of the lot, and it did not come back. She sat at a red light 2 blocks from the shop, and looked at the street in front of her, and thought that she had been driving around with a $60 problem for the better part of 6 weeks. 6 weeks of phone calls and waiting rooms and printouts and numbers that had no relationship to reality. 6 weeks of being handed explanations she had not asked for, in language designed to make clarity feel like expertise. 6 weeks of being treated as someone whose understanding of her own situation could be managed, redirected, shaped into whatever shape the person across the counter needed it to take. $60. The light changed. She drove. She had a meeting that afternoon with 2 of her largest clients. She sat across the table from them and negotiated the renewal terms of a contract worth more money than she wanted to think about in the context of the morning she had just had. She was sharp in the meeting. She was always sharp. But there was something different in how she felt sitting there, some small adjustment in her center of gravity that she could not entirely account for and did not try to. On her way home that evening, she stopped at a florist. She bought a small arrangement. She drove back to the east side and left it at the front desk of the shop, which was closed by then, with a note that said thank you and had her name and number on it. She did not know yet what came next. She did not know about the review she would write that night, or where that review would go, or what it would become. She only knew that the car was fixed, that the fix had cost $60, and that somewhere on the east side of the city, in a shop with a hand-painted sign and a crayon drawing on the corkboard, a man named Nathan Cole had told her the truth when no one else had been willing to, and had charged her only for the hour and the part, and had not added a single dollar for anything else. She drove home on a Friday evening with the windows down and the engine running clean. She had not felt this particular kind of quiet in a long time. Nathan Cole had been fixing cars since he was 17 years old. He had not planned it. He had not grown up dreaming of engines or aspiring to anything involving a wrench. He had grown up in a house where things broke and stayed broken because there was no money to call anyone, and he had learned, the way children in such houses learn, to look at broken things and figure them out. The first car he fixed was his uncle's pickup truck, which had stopped starting in the winter of Nathan's junior year of high school. He had borrowed a repair manual from the school library, read it over 3 evenings, and fixed the problem on a Saturday morning in his uncle's driveway. His uncle had looked at him afterward with an expression Nathan had not seen on many adult faces directed at him, and that expression had meant something. He had gone to a technical program after high school, not because anyone told him to, but because he had looked at what he was good at, and at what the world needed, and found a place where those 2 things met. He was methodical. He was patient. He did not rush things that should not be rushed, and he did not slow down things that could move faster. He had a way of listening to an engine that his instructors noted early and could not fully teach. It was the kind of attentiveness that either exists in a person or does not, and in Nathan it existed completely. He had worked at a dealership for 4 years after finishing his training. He had learned a great deal there. He had also watched things happen that he could not reconcile with the way he thought a person should work. He watched service advisors quote jobs that were twice what they needed to be. He watched customers leave with repairs they had not needed, and charges they had not understood. He watched it happen on purpose, not in a dramatic way. There was no single moment of obvious wrongdoing, no villain with a clear motive. It was quieter than that. It was the slow accumulation of small choices, made every day by people who had decided that a customer's confusion was an opportunity, and that the gap between what a repair actually cost and what a customer could be persuaded to pay was simply profit. He had left on a Friday afternoon, given 2 weeks' notice the following Monday, and never gone back. He had opened the shop with very little money and a great deal of careful planning. He rented the space on the corner, negotiated the lease down by promising to handle the building's vehicle maintenance himself, and spent 3 weeks cleaning and painting before he took his first customer. He priced everything the same way: the cost of the part, the cost of the time, and nothing else. No diagnostic fees unless the diagnostic took significant time and resources. No shop supply charges. No fees invented to fill a line on an invoice that would otherwise look too short. Word spread the way it spreads in neighborhoods where people actually talk to each other. Slowly at first, then more steadily. He was busy within 6 months. He had a wait list within a year. He had also, in that first year, become a father. His daughter's name was Lily. She was 5 years old now, which meant she had been born in the same year the shop opened, and raising her as a single parent while building a business had been the most demanding thing Nathan had ever done, and the most important. He did not often speak about how he had come to be raising her alone. It was not a story he told casually, and there was nothing in his manner that invited questions. What people who spent time around him understood was that Lily was the organizing fact of his life, the thing around which everything else arranged itself. She spent her after-school hours at the shop. She sat in the waiting area and did her homework on the side table, and sometimes drew things on the pieces of paper he kept in a folder for her. The crayon car on the corkboard had been there for 2 years. He had not taken it down. She was in kindergarten now. She was missing 2 teeth, the 2 front ones, and she had opinions about everything and was not shy about expressing them, including opinions about which of her father's regular customers she found interesting and which ones she thought talked too much. She had told Nathan on a Sunday morning, with great seriousness, that the man who brought in the blue station wagon every 3 months talked too much. Nathan had agreed that this was probably accurate. He thought about her while he worked. This was not distraction. His hands knew what they were doing well enough that his mind was free to move, and it moved, as it usually did, toward her school week, the parent-teacher meeting he had scheduled for the following Thursday, the Halloween costume she had decided upon, and then changed her mind about twice in the same afternoon, the fact that she had recently discovered she could whistle and had been practicing with a commitment that Nathan found both admirable and, at 7 in the morning, somewhat exhausting. He thought about her while he worked on Caroline Webb's SUV. He had known within the first few minutes of looking at the vehicle what was wrong with it. The crankshaft position sensor was sending an erratic signal. It was not a difficult diagnosis. It was the kind of thing a thorough mechanic finds in the first pass. He had checked everything else anyway, because that was how he worked, not to find more problems, but to confirm that the problems that existed were the only ones. He wanted to be certain. He always wanted to be certain. Everything else was fine. The engine mounts that one advisor had apparently identified as compromised were in solid condition. The suspension components that another had flagged were normal for the vehicle's age. The rear brakes had some wear, but they had a good deal of life left. He made a note to mention the brakes to her, not as an urgent repair, not as a scare, just as information she could have and use when she decided it was the right time. When he came back into the waiting area and sat down across from her, he watched her face when he told her what was wrong. He had developed, over years, an ability to read how much technical detail a person wanted and how much they needed versus how much was simply a performance of competence. Caroline Webb wanted the facts clearly. She was the kind of person who, when given accurate information, would do something useful with it. He could see that in the way she listened, not passively but actively, not waiting for him to finish but processing as he spoke. When she told him the numbers she had been quoted, he nodded. He had heard variations of this story enough times that it no longer had the power to surprise him, though it had never stopped having the power to bother him. Not loudly, just persistently. A low, steady bother, the same frequency as the knock that her vehicle had been carrying for 6 weeks. He told her $60. He said it the same way he said everything, plainly and without trying to dress it up. He was not offering her a deal. He was not doing her a favor. The part cost $11 and change. The labor would take him an hour and a half. $60 was what the job was worth, so $60 was what he charged. He watched her face when she heard the number. She repeated it back to him, and he said yes, and he saw her absorb it, not dramatically, not with visible emotion, but with the particular stillness of someone processing something that is simultaneously simple and enormous. He got up and went back to the bay. He put the new sensor in. The bracket gave him no trouble. He checked the connections, confirmed the signal was reading correctly, and ran the engine long enough to verify that the knock was gone and the warning light had cleared. He checked the rear brakes again while he was there and confirmed his original assessment. Serviceable, but worth watching in the next 10,000 miles or so. He wrote that down on a separate sheet to give her with the invoice. He liked this part of the work, not the mechanics of it, though he liked that too. He liked the moment when a car that had been running wrong began to run right. There was something satisfying in it that had nothing to do with the money, and everything to do with the specific pleasure of a problem correctly solved. He had felt it the first time he fixed his uncle's truck in that driveway years ago, and he felt it now, and the feeling had not diminished at all in the years between. He brought the vehicle around to the front. He wrote up the invoice. He walked back into the waiting area where Caroline was sitting, and he handed it to her. She read it. She looked up at him. She asked if she could add anything for the diagnostic, since he had spent time on it. He said no. The diagnostic was part of the job. She asked about a tip. He said he did not take tips. He said it without making her feel strange for asking. It was simply not something he did, and it had never been something he did, and he found that the people who asked were always the people who genuinely wanted to give something back, which he respected, even when he declined. She stood up and shook his hand. She said she would be back. He said he would be here. She left. He watched the vehicle pull out of the lot and disappear around the corner. And then he went back into the bay because there was another vehicle waiting. A man named Owen Croft who needed new brake pads and had been coming to Nathan for 8 years. He would be in at noon. Nathan had enough time to eat the sandwich he had packed that morning, check in with Lily's school about the Thursday meeting, and review the parts order he had placed on Wednesday. He did not think much about the morning's interaction, beyond the fact that it had gone as mornings at the shop usually went. A person came in with a problem, he found the problem, he fixed the problem, and they left with working vehicle. That was the job. That was all the job was, and Nathan had never needed it to be more than that. He did not know, eating his sandwich in the small office at the back of the shop, that Caroline Webb was going to write something that evening that would change the next 2 years of his life. He did not know that what she had experienced that morning, across 6 weeks and 7 dealerships and $60, was going to travel far beyond the two of them. He did not know that people he had never met were going to read her words and feel something specific and real, and that some of them would come to the shop on the east side because of it. He did not know any of that. He finished his sandwich. He called the school. He went back to work. Outside, the autumn light moved across the hand-painted sign above the bay doors, and the shop was quiet in the way that places are quiet, when the work is honest, and the people doing it have nothing to hide. Caroline sat at her kitchen table on Friday evening after dinner. She had cleaned the dishes, put on the news without really watching it, turned it off again, and then sat down at the table with her laptop in front of her and the house quiet around her. Her phone was beside the laptop. On the phone's screen was the spreadsheet with 7 rows and 7 estimates, the column of numbers she had built carefully over 6 weeks. She looked at it for a moment. Then she opened a new browser tab and navigated to the review platform she used for local businesses, the same one she had used twice in her life to leave feedback, once for a good experience at a restaurant a friend had recommended, and once for a terrible experience with a contractor who had not finished a job he had been paid to finish. She started typing. She did not plan what she was going to write. She had not rehearsed it or drafted it in her head on the drive home. She simply began with what had happened, in the order it had happened, and she wrote until she had said the thing she needed to say. She wrote about the warning light. She wrote about the 7 dealerships and what each of them had told her and what each of them had quoted her, without exaggerating any of the numbers, because the real numbers were already extraordinary enough. She wrote about finding Nathan's shop through a handwritten note passed through a chain of ordinary human kindness. She wrote about sitting in the waiting room with the 4 chairs and the old magazines and the child's drawing on the corkboard. She wrote about the way he had listened. She wrote about what he had found. She wrote about what he had charged. She did not call anyone dishonest. She did not use language that was heated or accusatory. She simply told what had happened, factually and precisely, the way she wrote everything. She read it back once. She made 2 small corrections. She posted it. Then she closed her laptop, went to bed, and slept better than she had in several weeks. She woke up to 47 notifications. She did not understand, for a moment, what she was looking at. She sat up in bed with her phone in her hand and scrolled through them. People had commented on the review. People had shared it. Someone had taken a screenshot and posted it somewhere else. And people had commented there too. By the time she had showered and made coffee, the number of responses had passed 100. By the time she arrived at her office, it was considerably more than that. She sat at her desk and read some of them. Most were from women. Not all, but most. They wrote things like, "This happened to me, and I thought I was imagining it." They wrote, "I brought my husband with me the second time, and the number they quoted was half what they told me alone." They wrote, I've been overcharged for years and never had the language for it, and now I do. Some wrote only a few words. Some wrote paragraphs. Some shared specific numbers from their own experiences that made Caroline's spreadsheet feel like a small sampling of something very large. Some were from men who were furious on behalf of the women in their lives. Daughters, wives, mothers. Some were from mechanics who said they knew exactly what she was describing and were glad someone had named it plainly. A few were from people who pushed back, who said that repair estimates varied for legitimate reasons, who said she could not know for certain what each dealership had or had not found. She read those responses too. She considered them fairly. And then she thought about her spreadsheet and the 7 different diagnoses for the same vehicle, with the same fault code, and she felt no need to argue. Her phone rang at 11 that morning. It was a local journalist who had seen the review and wanted to ask her some questions. She said she would think about it and call back, which she did, that afternoon, after deciding that the story was already out, and that if she was going to speak about it, she would rather speak about it accurately than let someone else speak about it imprecisely. The article ran online that evening and in print 2 days later. It was a good article. The journalist had done her work carefully. She had called 2 of the dealerships for comment. She had reached Nathan Cole, who had given a brief, direct quote that contained no self-congratulation and no embellishment. He had said, when asked why he only charged $60, that the job took an hour and a half and a $12 part, and that was what the job cost. He said it as though this were self-evident. The journalist reported that he had seemed genuinely puzzled by the question. Caroline read that line twice and felt something that she would have called, if she were being precise, a kind of affection. The article spread the way the review had spread, but faster and further. It was picked up by regional news sites and then by national ones. It was discussed on podcasts she had never heard of. It was cited in a newsletter about consumer advocacy. It appeared on social media accounts with large audiences, accompanied by commentary ranging from deeply thoughtful to aggressively oversimplified, as things on social media usually are. Nathan's phone rang for 3 solid days. He answered it when he could, and returned calls when he could not. He was polite and brief on every call. He was not overwhelmed by the attention. He was not comfortable with it either, which was a different thing. He had built his shop on the idea that the work spoke for itself, and the work speaking for itself had always meant the work and nothing else. The fixed engine, the honest invoice, the customer who drove away without a problem they had come in with. He was not sure what to do with a version of that principle that involved national news coverage, but he handled it the way he handled everything, with steadiness and without performance. His wait list went from 2 weeks to 6 weeks almost overnight. Caroline came back to the shop 3 weeks after the review posted. Not for a repair. The SUV was running perfectly. She came because she wanted to talk to Nathan directly about something she had been considering. She had sent several clients his way in the weeks since her review went public, people from her company whose vehicles needed work, and she had received consistent feedback that the experience was exactly what she had described. Good work, fair pricing, clear communication, the kind of thing that should be ordinary and is not. She sat in the waiting room again, in the same chair she had sat in before. Lily was doing homework at the side table. She was 6 years old, Caroline now knew, and very serious about subtraction. She introduced herself to Caroline without being prompted, which Nathan observed from the doorway with the specific expression of a parent who is simultaneously proud and unsure what is about to be said. What Lily said was that she had heard Caroline's name before because some people at school had mentioned it to her father, and was Caroline the lady whose car had only cost $60? Caroline said yes, she was that lady. Lily considered this for a moment and then went back to her subtraction. Nathan came in from the bay, and they sat and talked. Not in the formal way of a business meeting, but in the practical way of 2 people who have something concrete to discuss. Caroline had been thinking about whether there was anything she could do that would be genuinely useful, not just sending clients his way, which she would continue to do regardless, but something structural. She had connections with a small business association that offered low-interest expansion financing. She had contacts at a commercial real estate firm that sometimes helped independent businesses find better situated spaces when their leases came up. Nathan listened. He asked 2 questions, just as he had during her first visit. He was not resistant to the idea, but he was clear about what he wanted. He was not looking to expand into something he could not manage with the same care he brought to the shop now. He was not interested in scale for its own sake. What he was interested in, he said, was being able to hire one more mechanic, someone younger, someone coming out of a technical program, someone he could teach the way he had once wanted to be taught. He had enough business now to support that. What he needed was help finding the right person. Caroline said she knew 3 technical program directors. She said she would make some calls. He nodded. He said thank you in the same way he said everything else, directly and without excess. She stood to go. She looked once more at the corkboard, at the thank you notes and the crayon drawing. The drawing was still there in the lower right corner. My dad's shop, blue letters, no apostrophe. She said goodbye to Lily, who said goodbye back, and then, without looking up from her subtraction, mentioned that she had gotten 9 right and only 2 wrong, and was working on the 3rd. Caroline said that sounded like a very good morning. Lily said it was an afternoon. Then she erased something and started again. Caroline drove home. The engine was quiet. The roads were clear. The late afternoon light came through the windshield in long, warm angles, the way autumn light does when it is running out of year and wants you to notice it before it goes. She thought about what it had taken to find $60 worth of honesty. She thought about how many women were still looking. 2 years after Caroline Webb sat in a waiting room with 4 chairs and drove home with a fixed engine and a receipt for $60, the shape of things had changed in ways that neither she nor Nathan Cole had planned for, and both of them had contributed to without entirely intending to. The shop on the east side was still the same shop, same corner, same hand-painted sign, same corkboard in the waiting area. What had changed was the pace of it. Nathan had hired a mechanic named Connor Bradley, 24 years old, fresh out of the same kind of technical program Nathan had attended, and he had turned out to be exactly the kind of person Nathan had hoped to find. Careful, curious, honest about what he did not yet know, and determined to learn it. Nathan had taught him the way he had wanted to be taught, by working alongside him, by explaining the reasoning behind each step, by making it clear that the goal was always to find the actual problem, and fix the actual problem, and not to see the vehicle as an opportunity for anything beyond that. Connor had his own growing base of regulars within the first 6 months. A few of them had come because they had read about the shop after Caroline's story spread. Others had come because they lived nearby and had been meaning to try a different mechanic, and the timing had finally worked. All of them had stayed because the experience was what they had hoped it would be. Lily was 7 now. She had grown 1.5 inches in the past year and had strong opinions about chapter books, specifically about which ones were worth finishing and which ones were not. She still did her homework at the side table in the waiting area on school days when there was no after-school program. She had a new corkboard section she had claimed as her own, lower down on the wall where she could reach it, where she pinned drawings and a photograph of her class from the fall, and a list of words she was learning to spell. The words on the list changed every week. Nathan watched her from the bay sometimes, between jobs, through the window that looked into the waiting area. He watched her reading. He watched her talking to the customers, who, without exception, found her delightful and were occasionally educated by her on topics she felt they needed to know more about. A man named Gerald Marsh, who came in every 4 months with a truck that had strong opinions about its own maintenance schedule, had learned more about the migration patterns of monarch butterflies from Lily than he had from any other source in his 63 years. Nathan thought, watching her sometimes, about the years that had passed since he had left the dealership and opened this place on a corner, with white paint going slightly gray at the edges. He thought about the choices that had seemed, at the time, like large, uncertain things, and that now simply felt like the facts of his life. This shop, this neighborhood, this daughter who had opinions about chapter books, and the migration of butterflies, and the correct method of making a sandwich. He did not think of himself as someone who had done something remarkable. He had done a job correctly, and charged what it cost, and told a person the truth. He would have done the same if no one had ever written a word about it. But he understood that something had traveled outward from that Friday morning, something he had not sent deliberately, and could not take responsibility for, and did not entirely know how to hold. He had received letters, actual letters on paper sent to the shop's address, from people in other cities and other states, people who had read about the $60 and written to tell him what it had meant to them. Not the money itself, but what the money represented. The idea that competence and fairness were not in competition with each other, that a person could be good at a thing and honest about it, and neither quality needed to compromise the other. He had kept several of the letters. They were on the corkboard, among the thank you notes that had always been there. Caroline Webb had, in the 2 years since, become something she had not expected to become and was still adjusting to. She had been asked to speak at 3 industry conferences, 2 of them about her original field of logistics, and one of them, unexpectedly, about consumer advocacy and the systemic patterns she had documented in her spreadsheet. She had given that talk once and turned down 2 subsequent invitations, not because she did not believe in what she had said, but because she was a CEO and not an activist, and she wanted to be careful about the difference. She had, however, done something she found more practically satisfying. She had worked with the Small Business Association contact she had mentioned to Nathan, and through that connection had helped establish a referral network for independent mechanics in her region. Vetted, reviewed, recommended by actual customers, with transparent pricing as a requirement for participation. It was small. It was not a revolution. But it existed now when it had not existed before, and 6 independent shops had joined in the first year, and the wait lists at all of them had grown. Nathan's shop was the first on the list. She came back to the shop on the 2nd anniversary of her first visit. She did not tell Nathan she was coming. She simply pulled in on a Friday morning, same as the first time, and walked into the waiting area with the 4 chairs and the side table, and the 2 corkboards, and the long institutional memory of everyone who had passed through and left a note to say so. Lily was not there. She was at school. Nathan came out from the bay and shook Caroline's hand and said good morning, and they stood for a moment in the small space between the chairs and the corkboard without needing to fill it with anything. He asked how the SUV was running. She said it had been running fine for 2 years. He nodded. He said that was good. She said she had wanted to stop in and tell him about the referral network. She gave him a folder with the details, not because he needed to join, not as a pitch, but because she wanted him to know what had come from the morning he had spent an hour and a half on a crankshaft position sensor, what had come from the $11 part and the $60 invoice, and the way he had said the number without dressing it up. He took the folder, he opened it. He read the first page in the way he listened to engines, with the particular attention of someone who is actually taking in what is in front of them. Then he closed it. He looked up at her. He said that was something. She said she thought so. He said he would read the rest of it tonight, after Lily was in bed. She said that sounded right. She looked at the corkboard one more time before she left. The crayon drawing was still there, my dad's shop, the same blue letters, the same generous interpretation of automotive proportion, the same missing apostrophe. It had been there for 3 years now. She suspected it would be there for a long time to come. She walked out through the bay doors into the Friday morning light. The street was quiet. The laundromat down the block had its door propped open. The hardware store was already busy. The neighborhood moved at its own pace, the way neighborhoods do when they are old enough to know what they are. She drove away. The engine was clean and quiet and exactly right. Behind her, in the shop on the corner, a man named Nathan Cole went back to a vehicle that needed his attention, and a corkboard held every word that people had left behind when they realized they had been treated the way they deserved to be treated, and a drawing hung in the lower right corner where a child had pinned it. Blue letters on white paper, steady and simple and missing its apostrophe, and entirely, completely, true.